Imagine standing on a perfectly flat horizon that stretches so far in every direction that the curvature of the Earth itself becomes almost believable. No ridge, no summit, no silhouette of stone breaking the endless sky above you. The world we picture when we think of geography is one of dramatic peaks and plunging valleys, yet some nations exist entirely without a single mountain, shaped instead by forces far older and stranger than any volcanic eruption or tectonic collision. This is not an accident of cartography or a failure of imagination. It is the deep signature of Earth's most ancient and powerful geological story, written across the flattest surfaces on the planet. The countries we're exploring today sit on what geologists call cratons, vast, primordial shields of rock so old and so stable that the violent mountain-building forces that sculpted other continents passed over them almost completely, leaving them eerily, magnificently smooth. These are lands where time has done the opposite of building, where billions of years of wind, water, and patient erosion have ground down whatever peaks once dared to rise, polishing continents into something resembling the floor of a drained and ancient sea. Think of Bangladesh, Kuwait, the Maldives, nations where the highest point might be a gentle riverbank, a modest dune, or a coral reef barely kissing the surface of the ocean, their elevation measured not in thousands of meters but in single digits. Each of these flat nations tells a radically different origin story. Some were shaped by the slow retreat of vast inland seas, others by the relentless deposit of river sediment over millions of years, building land outward rather than upward. The Maldives, for instance, sits atop a submerged volcanic plateau whose peaks have been slowly consumed by the sea, leaving only the coral archipelago we see today, a country defined not by height but by the fragile grace of its survival above water. Bangladesh occupies one of the largest river deltas on Earth, where the Ganges and Brahmaputra have spent millennia dropping their sediment loads into the Bay of Bengal, constructing an entire nation from the ground up, grain by grain, season by season. What unites all these places is something profound. They are living proof that greatness in geography does not require altitude, that a land can be extraordinary precisely because it has chosen, through the slow logic of geology, to remain beautifully, defiantly low. And yet, to truly understand why some lands have never risen, we must look beneath the surface, not just of the Earth, but of time itself, stretching back hundreds of millions of years to a world whose continents bore no resemblance to the maps we know today. The story begins with the ancient supercontinent Pangaea, when what would become our flattest nations lay pressed together in a vast, undifferentiated mass, far from the violent collision zones where mountain ranges are born and thrust skyward through unimaginable tectonic force. Mountains, after all, are not simply features of the land, they are scars, monuments to catastrophic meetings between tectonic plates, places where the crust has been crumpled like paper by forces so immense they defy human comprehension, squeezing rock upward over tens of millions of years. Where those collisions never happened, where plates drifted apart rather than together, or where ancient cratons sat stable and unmoved through geological epoch after epoch, the land was left to its own quiet devices, neither lifted nor folded, simply enduring. The Eurasian steppe, stretching from Hungary to Manchuria in an almost incomprehensible ribbon of grassland, exists because the ancient platform beneath it has remained tectonically dormant for so long that erosion has had nothing dramatic to work with, only the slow, patient wearing away of what little relief once existed. In West Africa, the Great Basins of Chad and the Niger Inland Delta sit atop some of the most geologically ancient and stable rock on Earth, cratons so old and so settled that they have essentially forgotten what upheaval feels like, resting in a stillness measured not in centuries but in geological ages. This geological tranquility creates something scientists call a peneplain, a landscape so thoroughly worn by time and weather that it approaches a theoretical flatness, a surface that has been eroded and re-eroded until the very concept of a hill becomes almost an anomaly worth remarking upon. It is a profound inversion of how we tend to think about dramatic landscapes, because here, the drama is not in what was built, but in what was so relentlessly, so patiently taken away, leaving behind a canvas of extraordinary openness that stretches to every horizon without interruption. The sky becomes the dominant feature in such places, not as backdrop, but as the primary landscape itself, a vast, active presence that flat nations experience with an intimacy that no mountain country ever could, where weather systems move across the land like slow, magnificent theater visible from 50 miles away. This is the quiet geological contract that flatness represents, a covenant between ancient rock and deep time, between the forces that could have made mountains and the long stillness that chose otherwise, producing nations whose geography is not an absence of wonder, but a different and rarer kind of it entirely. And yet there is something else that flatness does, something that mountains, for all their grandeur, can never quite accomplish. It creates an unbroken human horizon, a world where settlements and civilizations spread laterally rather than vertically, where the geometry of society itself is shaped by the absence of peaks to cluster around, to defend, to name, to fear. Consider the Netherlands, where the flatness is not accidental but engineered, a nation that has spent centuries in active conversation with the sea, pumping and diking and reclaiming land from water, essentially manufacturing its own territory from the floor of what should be ocean. The Dutch didn't simply inherit a flat country, they built one, meter by careful meter, making their geography a monument to collective will rather than tectonic fortune. Bangladesh tells a different story, one written in silt and monsoon, a country so magnificently flat that during seasonal flooding, entire districts dissolve into a single inland sea, with villages becoming islands and roads becoming rivers almost overnight. The flatness here is not a stable condition but a dynamic one, a landscape in perpetual negotiation between land and water, between the solid and the temporary. This is where geography becomes biography, because nations without mountains develop a fundamentally different relationship with movement, with distance, with the very concept of going somewhere. In a flat country, every journey is a horizontal one, unmarked by the drama of ascent and descent, which sounds monotonous until you realize that it makes the destination itself, rather than the journey, the entire psychological event. The Kazakh steppe understands this intimately, stretching across what is essentially a vast geological plate, so enormous and so level that nomadic cultures developed entirely different philosophies of home, ones not rooted in a fixed place but carried across the flat immensity like a thought moving through an open mind. Home, in a mountainless place like this, becomes something you bring with you rather than something you return to. Flatness also does something remarkable to sound. In genuinely flat countries, with no valley walls to trap or redirect it, sound travels differently, dissipating into open space rather than bouncing back amplified from stone faces. There is a particular silence in the great flat nations that has no equivalent anywhere on Earth, a silence so complete and so three-dimensional that early travelers across the American prairies described it as a kind of vertigo of the ears. Light, too, belongs differently to a flat country, not filtered through mountain shadow or carved into dramatic valleys of gold and dark, but arriving whole and democratic, falling equally on everything it touches. The golden hour in a flat nation is not a slant of brilliance against a peak but a total transformation, a moment when the entire visible world shifts color simultaneously, as if a single hand had turned a dial. Which means the countries we call flat are not simply places where mountains failed to appear, they are places where a specific set of civilizational possibilities became available, where certain kinds of agriculture, certain kinds of empire, certain kinds of spiritual philosophy took root precisely because the land offered no interruption to the long view. The flat world is a world of horizons, and horizons have always invited a particular kind of human dreaming. What flatness ultimately offers, and this is perhaps its most profound geographical gift, is the purest possible encounter with scale, with the sheer, unmediated size of the planet. Standing on a mountain, you are above the world, looking down at its curvature. Standing on a flat plain, you are inside the world's dimensions, feeling its actual vastness pressing in on you from every direction. A sensation so rare and so quietly overwhelming that those who have truly felt it describe it not as emptiness, but as a kind of terrifying, beautiful fullness. That fullness has a name in certain languages. The Kazakh call it dala. The Russian steppe traditions speak of prostor, a word that translates roughly as vastness without end, and in both cases the word carries an emotional charge, a mixture of freedom and exposure, that simply does not exist in cultures shaped by mountains. The nations without mountains are also, not coincidentally, the nations most exposed to what geographers call continental air masses, those vast, unimpeded rivers of temperature that pour across flat terrain with nothing to slow them, which is why Bangladesh floods with a totality that feels almost biblical, why the American Great Plains can be 40 degrees below zero in January and 40 degrees above zero in July. This climatic extremity is itself a shaping force, because societies that must survive wild thermal swings develop different relationships with storage, with community, with the calendar. The granary is not merely an economic structure on a flat plain. It is a spiritual anchor, the physical proof that collective effort can hold back the chaos of an uninterrupted sky. Water, on a flat world, behaves in ways that seem almost willful. Denied the steep gradient that would carry it quickly to the sea, it spreads laterally, pools, seeps, creates the vast inland deltas and seasonal wetlands that have fed some of the densest human populations in history, the Bengal Delta being the most extraordinary example, a place where flatness and water together created a biological engine of almost incomprehensible fertility. The irony embedded in that fertility is profound. The very countries that contain no mountains are often the countries most vulnerable to the sea, because flatness at the coast means no natural barrier, no headland, no cliff, only the long undefended shore where ocean and continent meet on equal terms, which is precisely why the Netherlands spent 6 centuries in the extraordinary project of arguing with geography itself. To argue with flat geography is not to build upward, as mountain civilizations never needed to do, but to build outward and downward. The Dutch did not conquer their landscape by ascending it but by subtracting water from it, a fundamentally different relationship with the earth, one that requires not individual heroism but the kind of patient, distributed, generational cooperation that the Dutch called waterschappen, water governance boards, one of the earliest forms of democratic infrastructure in the world. There is a philosophical dimension to this that deserves to linger. When your survival depends not on climbing above the danger but on collectively managing the level of the ground beneath your feet, you develop a civilizational instinct for consensus, for negotiation, for the idea that the landscape is something you maintain together rather than something you conquer alone. And it may be no accident that the flattest nations on Earth have often produced the most sophisticated traditions of civic cooperation. But flatness is not only about water and survival, it is also about light, about the quality of illumination that falls on a landscape with no shadows, no valleys to hold the dark, no peaks to catch the last gold of the evening, just the pure, democratic distribution of sunlight across an undivided surface, which is why painters from the Netherlands to the Gangetic Plain have long been obsessed with sky, because on a flat world the sky is not background, it is the primary subject. That sky, enormous, present, impossible to ignore, becomes in flat cultures a kind of vertical mountain, the one dimension in which drama still lives, and perhaps that is the deepest truth about the countries with no peaks. They did not lose the vertical, they simply moved it upward, trading stone for cloud, trading altitude for atmosphere, and finding in the boundless overhead what their ancestors might once have found in the climb. And if the sky becomes the mountain, then weather becomes the wilderness, the untamed, unpredictable force that flat country people have always known could arrive without warning, without the buffer of terrain to slow it, without ridgelines to break the wind before it reaches your door, just open air delivering whatever the atmosphere decides, directly, personally, and without negotiation. Think of the great storm cultures that emerged from flatness, the Bangladeshi cyclone season, the tornado corridors of the American plains, the North Sea gales that battered the Dutch coast for centuries. These are not incidental features of flat geography. They are its defining dramas. The moments when the land's surrender of vertical defense becomes a vulnerability so acute it shaped entire civilizations' relationship with fear and preparation. In the Netherlands, the windmill was never merely a machine, it was an act of defiance against a landscape that offered no natural shelter, a human-made vertical object rising from the flatness to do what mountains could not, to catch the force of moving air and redirect it toward human purpose, turning vulnerability into ingenuity, turning exposure into power. Flat countries, scholars have noted, tend to produce extraordinary civil engineers, not because flat terrain demands less skill, but because it demands different skill, the kind of patient, systemic thinking required when you cannot simply build around an obstacle, because there are no obstacles, only the slow accumulation of water, wind, and time working against you at every point simultaneously. Bangladesh, one of the world's most densely populated nations and nearly entirely flat, sits at the confluence of three massive river systems, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, and the Meghna, and the entire country is essentially a living delta, a landscape so new in geological terms that parts of it did not exist 1,000 years ago, still forming, still shifting, still arguing with the sea about where the land ends. That argument between land and sea in flat nations is not a metaphor, it is a daily negotiation, a literal redrawing of boundaries that happens with each monsoon, each storm surge, each centimeter of sea level rise. And the people who live on these margins have developed a philosophical relationship with impermanence that mountain cultures, anchored to their granite certainties, rarely need to cultivate. There is a word in Bengali, balabasha, that some linguists trace its emotional weight to the experience of loving something you know may be taken by water, a tenderness sharpened by the knowledge of loss, and whether or not that etymology holds, the sentiment it captures is unmistakably the sentiment of a flat country people who have always known their home exists on borrowed ground. Flatness also reshapes warfare and empire in ways that mountains flatly prevent. The great conquering armies of history moved fastest across plains, and the countries without natural barriers have been invaded, occupied, and redrawn more frequently than almost any mountain nation, which is why the cultures of flat lands often carry a layered, composite identity, built from wave after wave of people who swept across the open ground and left something of themselves behind. Poland, landlocked and largely flat, was erased from European maps entirely for over a century, carved between empires that used its open terrain as a corridor of conquest, and yet Polish identity survived not because the geography protected it, but because the people discovered that culture itself could be a kind of terrain, a homeland you carry inward when the outward one is taken. Invisible mountains built from language and music and memory. This is perhaps the final, extraordinary lesson that the countries with no mountains teach the rest of the world, that geography shapes culture but does not determine it, that human beings are not merely products of their landscape but its authors, capable of finding in a flat horizon not the absence of drama but the purest possible canvas, one on which every story written stands fully exposed, fully visible, with nowhere to hide and nothing left to climb except toward meaning itself. And yet even as we absorb that lesson, that culture can become geography, that identity can root itself in something deeper than stone, we must reckon with one more question that the flat lands quietly insist upon. What happens to a nation's sense of grandeur when the sky itself becomes the only vertical drama it possesses? The answer, it turns out, is that the sky becomes everything, and in countries like the Netherlands and Bangladesh, where horizon lines stretch unbroken in every direction, the heavens are not background but protagonist, a living ceiling that changes by the hour, painted in cloud formations that mountainous nations never pause long enough to truly see. Dutch Golden Age painters understood this intuitively, which is why Vermeer and Ruysdael devoted more canvas to sky than to earth, not because they lacked subjects, but because in a land without peaks, light itself becomes topography, casting shadows that move like slow tides across fields and polders, turning an ordinary afternoon into something almost sacred. Bangladesh takes this vertical relationship with the sky one step further, because its flatness is not merely geological but hydrological. The entire nation is a living delta, a place where land and water are in permanent, unresolved negotiation, and where the monsoon sky does not simply arrive but transforms the very shape of the country beneath it. During the annual floods, Bangladesh does not experience disaster in the way outsiders imagine. For millions of its people, the inundation is a seasonal rhythm as old as civilization itself, the water carrying nutrients that make its soil among the richest on earth, a reminder that the same geography that makes a land vulnerable also makes it extraordinarily alive. There is a word in Bangla, Bangladesh, meaning the land of the lower reaches, the land that flows downward, and it captures something essential about how cultures without mountains develop a different relationship to permanence, learning to build identity not on a movable rock but on the beautiful, terrifying, generative fact of constant change. Kuwait and Qatar sit at the other extreme of flatness, not watered but scorched, their surfaces scraped to near mathematical levels by millennia of wind, their landscapes so spare and absolute that early travelers described them not as empty but as clarified, as though the desert had burned away everything inessential and left only the fundamental geometry of the world. That clarification created societies of extraordinary social density, because when the exterior landscape offers no shelter, no variation, no intimate geography of hidden valleys and forested ridges, human beings build those things inward. In architecture, in hospitality rituals, in the elaborate moral codes of desert culture where a stranger's survival depends entirely on the generosity of those they meet. The Kazakh steppe, that immense, rolling, almost oceanic grassland stretching across Central Asia, produced the yurt, a structure so perfectly adapted to flat, open, wind-swept terrain that its design has barely changed in 2,000 years. A portable mountain in a sense, a rounded peak a family carries with them across a landscape that offers no fixed high ground of its own. And here, at last, is what the flat lands have been telling us across every culture, every century, every horizon we have crossed in this journey, that the absence of mountains is not an absence of meaning, but an invitation to locate meaning differently, to understand that what we climb toward in this life was never made of rock, that the most important peaks have always been the ones we build inside ourselves, invisible and unassailable, rising quietly above whatever terrain fate places beneath our feet. And yet the flat lands leave one final gift, not a lesson drawn from absence, but a revelation born from it, that every civilization that ever rose without a single summit still reached upward, still carved its prayers into the open sky, still found a way to say here, this matters, this endures. Consider Bangladesh, one of the most mountain-starved nations on earth, a country shaped almost entirely by river delta and floodplain, where the horizon is always water and sky, and where the people have learned to build meaning not in stone, but in the stitching of Nakshi Kanta quilts, each one a world map made of thread, a landscape embroidered into memory. The Netherlands offers perhaps the most quietly radical reframing of all, a country that did not simply accept flatness, but manufactured its own land from the sea, reclaiming earth from water through centuries of engineered will, so that every field you walk across was once an ocean floor, and the ground itself is an act of human defiance made permanent. Iraq's ancient Mesopotamian plains, the very cradle between the Tigris and Euphrates where civilization first struck root, gave the world the ziggurat, those immense stepped towers built not because the land demanded height, but because the human spirit demanded it, because something deep within us insists on building toward a sky that flatness has left entirely, beautifully exposed. The Camargue in southern France, where the Rhône dissolves into wetland and salt flat before surrendering to the Mediterranean, is a place where the sky does not sit above the landscape, it consumes it, where pink flamingos stand like living brushstrokes across a canvas of silver water, and the wind writes its own unmapped geography across every raid and ripple. Botswana's Makgadikgadi, one of the largest salt pans on Earth, a blinding white expanse that was once a vast inland sea, becomes each rainy season a mirror so perfect that the sky cannot be told from the ground, so that to stand at its center is to feel suspended inside a world without edges, without orientation, without the anchor of elevation. Finland's Lake District, that endless interlocking mosaic of 10,000 lakes and low pine forest, has no dramatic peaks to organize the mind, and so it teaches a different kind of attention, a patience with horizontal detail, with the way light moves slowly across water all day long, with stillness as something not empty but luminous and full. Kuwait, one of the flattest countries on the entire planet, sits beneath some of the most spectacular skies in the world, sunsets that pour across unobstructed horizons in molten orange and deep violet, as though the earth, having given nothing upward, receives everything back from the heavens in extraordinary compensation. These flat nations are not geographical footnotes, not the spaces between the mountains on the map, they are civilizations of extraordinary depth and resilience. Places where the full weight of human culture found expression not through verticality but through endurance, through water, through memory, through the almost sacred act of remaining on difficult ground and calling it home. And so the final truth of the flat world is this, that geography shapes, but never determines, that the absence of altitude has never once produced an absence of greatness, and that some of the most magnificent views in human history have been witnessed by people standing on perfectly level ground, looking not upward at a peak, but outward across an infinite, open, unheld horizon. And perhaps that is the most quietly radical idea that geography has ever offered us, that wonder does not require elevation, that awe does not demand a summit, and that the horizon itself, stretching unbroken in every direction, is one of the most humbling and magnificent things a human eye can ever be asked to take in. The flat nations of the world have taught us something that mountains, for all their grandeur, cannot, that permanence is not about rising above the earth, but about belonging to it so completely that the land and the people become, over centuries, nearly indistinguishable from one another, their histories written not in stone faces but in river deltas and tidal rhythms and the slow, patient language of soil. Think of Bangladesh in monsoon season, when the rivers reclaim the land and entire communities lift their lives onto boats and bamboo platforms, not fleeing geography but negotiating with it. A negotiation so ancient and so refined that it has become its own form of genius, a water literacy passed down through generations like a sacred text. Think of the Netherlands, where engineers dreamed landscapes into existence, where the sea was not a boundary but a material to be worked, shaped, reasoned with. A country that did not accept the world it was given but redesigned it with such precision and ambition that it became, in the truest sense, a civilization built entirely by human will. These places remind us, finally, that the story of the earth is not told only in its peaks, it is told in its plains and its marshes, its salt flats and its open skies, in every civilization that looked at flat, difficult, waterlogged, wind-scoured ground and chose not to leave, but to stay, and to build something there that has lasted, quietly and magnificently, through all the ages of the world. Thank you for watching. Stay grounded, stay hopeful, and look for the answers within.